Hey everybody, this is Brian Miller. Welcome to my session for the xAPI party. So I'm going to be talking basically a session called Ready to Get Pedantic, picking the best verb or actually term for statements. See, I'm already doing it. So I'm Brian Miller. I work for Rusty Software. I've been with the company for about 10 years, and I came in working for them, kind of doing some xAPI evangelism stuff. So this is back in the days when it was still referred to as the Tin Can API, the 0.9 version for any of you that were around back then. I moved from there to work on one of our product teams, our Rusty Engine product, which has our LRS component in it. A number of you have probably used it, or you've used it through Cloud, our Storm Cloud product, and moved from there to team lead and then became director of engineering. So I kind of oversee all of our product teams here. And I still do a lot of work with the CMI5 working group, a number of the xAPI groups, really trying to stay engaged with the specifications and the e-learning standards themselves. So part of that role is I end up talking to a lot of people, and this talk actually came out of one of those discussions where I received a support ticket. You know, we say, ask us anything, and we really mean that. And so I replied to that ticket with a whole long story written out, and then that became a blog post, and then someone saw that, and that kind of morphed into this speaking kind of assignment. So what I'll be talking about today, importance of natural language. I'll touch on this a little bit because it's one of those things that people really struggle with when they go from, you know, kind of an instructional design or a learning design background, and they're thinking in terms of English or their native language, and they're not thinking of things in terms of what a computer system can understand. So talk a little bit about that. Considerations when you can't find just the right xAPI term, or maybe you're having to decide between one that is already out there, already being used, but is maybe not quite right for your situation. Key takeaways from both of those paths, and then how that leads into semantic interoperability. You know, how do we understand the data? And then I'll talk a little bit about sharing data, reporting and analytics, and then just kind of cover xAPI profiles. One of the really nice things about giving this talk is that usually when I go into a room full of people, people are still asking what is an LRS or what the heck is an xAPI statement. So it's really nice to know that all of you actually have a fair amount of experience already with this. You've already been thinking about it. So importance of natural language. You know, one of the things that we're finding out in the last, say, 10 years with natural language is just how difficult it is to understand natural language, because systems themselves struggle with, or we struggle to create systems that can understand tone, can understand context clues, all of those things that even, you know, young children start to pick up on. You know, as a parent, you raise your voice and the volume of your voice changes completely what you're saying to that other person. Having a computer understand that, or having us be able to generate enough data for a computer to understand that, is really a problem. And the concept of xAPI starts to work on that problem. Computers are really great at handling huge quantities of very, very specific data, which is how we end up with different verb identifiers and terms and those types of things. But we're just scratching the surface of what is capable, what we can be producing, and how we go about understanding that. So what do I mean by a term? And this is where I'm going to start to venture very deep into pedantic territory, right? A term is an identifier. That's basically it. Today, we're going to talk mostly about verbs, because that seems to be the one that most people latch onto when they're first starting their xAPI experience, because it's the thing that kind of provides action. It's the thing that's really interesting. But within the xAPI spec, we kind of consider terms as to be a verb, an activity type, extensions themselves, attachment usage types, anything that needs an identifier, particularly those where we use an IRI. Those are what we consider terms. When I'm talking about an activity here, most of us are familiar about using an activity as the object of a statement, what our action is working against, or what we're experiencing. In this case, I'm really thinking about activities more as the things that you tend to find in a context. So the grouping of something, so a term to identify a group. If I'm talking about the category context, then probably I'm looking at a pointer to a profile. So the profile is going to be telling me more about the meaning of that statement. And so in that case, I'm really thinking of it as a term rather than the experience itself or a portion of that experience. So again, today I plan on talking about verbs primarily, but really most of what is said can equally apply to any of the other terms. So there's definitely a lot to consider. You're starting out, you think, oh, I'm going to capture this experience. And usually for most people, it's very clear who the actor is. For those of us that are coming kind of from a traditional e-learning background, probably there's a learner sitting in front of the screen. If you're venturing past that, then maybe you're getting to an instructor or a team in a simulation. The actor becomes very obvious. Oftentimes the object is very obvious. What's the experience? And even when we start talking about like a quiz or an assessment, maybe even down to a question or an interaction in that assessment, what the object of that statement is very clear. So how do we get to the verb? Well, obviously one of the first places to start is using an existing term. There's got to be a verb out there for what I want. So maybe I go and I search, I ask somebody, I look for a profile, and I find that term. But is it quite right? Not sure. If I don't feel comfortable with that, then I need to create my own term. Or maybe instead what I've done, instead of going out and searching, is I just sit down and say, I'm going to write some xAPI statements. And so I just go through and I create all the terms I want, all in my namespace. So those are the types of problems that we start to look into. With existing terms, they need to match semantic meaning of the term with how it is typically used in context rather than just spoken language form. I'll talk a lot more about that. A problem with creating your own terms is you have to have ownership of, or at least permission to, use a particular namespace. I can't just go out there and create URIs or IRIs that are identifiers for my terms in just any namespace. So I have to have at least access to a namespace. Now there's a few public ones available, the W3ID org stuff. We made one available through our registry. Those types of things will probably become more prevalent. The other thing that we have to think about is versioning of terms, right? And so it's very easy to sit down and say, on my first project, I'm going to create these new items, or even borrow from other people. But I end up with a term that doesn't have a version. And so maybe in the future, we could be looking 3, 4, 5 years down the road. If we're talking about SCORM perspective, we're talking 20 years down the road, right? I may need to change slightly the meaning of that term, or I may need to add, if it's an extension, I may need to add a different type of value that can be associated with that term, which means I probably need a way to version those. So that's another thing that should be considered when we're creating terms, but is often left behind because we're just not very experienced at this yet. So let's talk about an example. The verb uploaded. So if I have a statement and I think my statement should be Bob uploaded a photo. The verb uploaded isn't really found in the ADL profiles. I'm not sure that there are any profiles out there right now that use a verb that is uploaded. Existing related verbs are imported and added, but are those quite the right thing? That's what we're going to talk about. You could import an electronic photo into a digital photo album, right? On another system. The key to watch out for here is the information that you're trying to capture. And when I say that, I mean something very specific. So added has this notion of, I'm going to include something in something else. That's all added is. So maybe that's appropriate for a photo. Maybe it's appropriate that I want to import this thing. So I'm giving the suggestion that not only is the photo being added to some list, I'm also transferring the data for that photo. So that might be something that's more like imported. Uploaded itself is even slightly more different than that. So uploaded is more this concept of I'm going to send data from one system to another, but isn't just sending data. It's not necessarily adding it to a collection of items. There may not be a photo album on the other end. It may be just that I'm transferring a file. And so those are the types of nuance that we start to see, even though verbs like uploaded, imported, added all look very similar and act very similar to us humans in our natural language processing. For a system, those look like very different terms. Uploaded and imported can both be considered ways of adding something. So it's really, we got to dial down that distinction using the context clues that go along with that statement. The other problem we run into is just, synonyms in language that we're already used to. So I can talk about import of a photo into a photo album, and right now I'm talking about a file. Well, what if I mean an import of a good from another country, right? So we're talking about the transfer of data between systems, but I'm not sure we would use the same verb or the same term to talk about adding a shipping container to a docking yard or something like that. You wouldn't use added in that case. You may not even use imported. Those are the types of problems that we run into when we're looking at associating an identifier with something, a concept that we know ourselves. So then this is another common example that I've run into when talking to a number of people. So Amy clicked a link, right? So the act of clicking a button on a mouse or a mouse-like device isn't really the correct expression. It's not usually what we're looking for. So the concept of clicking is how we execute a particular action, but it's probably not the interesting piece of information here, right? And we even see that with the mouse-like usage. So we said mouse-like in our presentation, A, because we're being pedantic, and B, because maybe it's not even a mouse. Maybe it's a trackpad. Maybe we're navigating with our user keyboard. Maybe we're using voice command software. So the interesting piece of information here, not just the data, the information that we're looking for is that a link was visited, or we opened a page, or we loaded a website, we loaded something. It's that action, it's the experience of loading or visiting or seeing that is of more interest to us than clicking the button. The click is just the way we've executed that other experience or that other action. And so usually when I point this out, it's that using a verb like clicked is not what you want. It's actually probably not a best practice, a worst practice. Now, is there a place where clicked makes sense? Absolutely, right? So we have run into customers who are developing tools to build user interfaces, for instance, and they may need to differentiate between clicked or keyboard navigation or voice control. As long as they're differentiating between those things, and it is the actual physical mechanism of clicking a mouse that matters, then that's a fine use case of it. For the vast majority, they just want to visit a link or they want to load a page. So key takeaways from all of this. The definition of the verb matters. The meaning, which is very similar to the definition, definitely matters. These are very specific to use cases and they're both critical. When it comes to using an existing verb that is similar, be careful that it is not just close enough. This is that added imported thing. We have to understand the context of where that term was coined and how it was intended to be used. We can't necessarily just go out and find a verb that is intended for importing of shipping containers and all of a sudden just use the word or use that same term because the English definition of it was imported for importing a photo album, for instance. Settling for using an existing verb ID rather than adding a new one definitely can cause ramifications down the road. If we're using a verb and we have a whole stack of data and we're going to pump it into a learning analytics tool or some other data collection service, then that system is going to understand that verb to have the exact same meaning. And so if other statements around the statement that includes that term don't seem to match that context, then we run the risk of really kind of messing up that other system. Now, having said that, using an existing verb ID when appropriate can definitely be beneficial. As long as the meaning of that verb and all of its context that goes along with it is the same, then we know that we can use that same data analytics tool for multiple different experiences and still use the reporting from it or the understanding that it derives from those statements because we have used the same terms. So there is a benefit here. One of the things that I like to point out is, so back in the 0.9 days, all of the verb list was set. We had like 9 or 10 verbs. They were English, and that pretty quickly turned out to be an obvious problem. How can we go through and expect xAPI to take off in all of the ways that all of us want it to if we're restricted to only using 10 verbs? So what is semantic interoperability? So we want to derive essentially the same meaning from sets of data generated from different sources, right? So we have maybe different authoring tools. Maybe we have an AR/VR set up along with some traditional e-learning content, and maybe there's some offline instruction occurring. And so we want to be able to derive any of those similar types of experiences that occur, or the data captured from those similar experiences, where we can match it up and understand those to be the same thing. So the xAPI specification itself was very intentional in its use of verb identifiers as IRIs. And so again, as the 0.9 reference, we figured out from 0.9 to 0.95, I believe that's when it was, that just having a verb as a single word wasn't going to cut it. We needed to go to this space where people could create their own terms. They could associate it with a specific definition. And so it was very intentional to switch that up. So we do use some verbs interchangeably, the imported added, but how well that works in practice definitely depends on the context. Again, we have to look for those semantic markers that mean that the same use of data in two different experiences is intended to be the same. In other words, the system on the other end that's understanding that data, ingesting that data, needs to be able to say, yes, that is the same experience occurring. So again, this gets us to the shared data, the reporting analytics. So the key to interoperability is disparate systems interpreting data the same way. So this can help us reduce the amount of work we have to do in a new system, because perhaps we've already got a whole bunch of data being captured. We've already gotten a whole bunch of reporting written. Maybe we have other use cases. And so when we add a new experience into that environment, all of the parts of that environment that already exist can leverage the data immediately, and they can already draw meaning out of it. So looking at new terms, again, the data may look very nice if we just create all of our own new terms. And so all of the verbs and all of the context extensions and all of the attachment types all have the same namespace at the front of them. So it looks very neat and orderly. Ultimately, that means we have to do more work, because every system that encompasses or encounters our data is going to have to understand that new meaning. It's going to have to learn what that is and how it's going to be associated with data or types of data that it already knows about, and whether or not they have the same or similar meaning. So one of the key takeaways here is that xAPI data was not intended to be siloed. One of the very first principles of xAPI, and back then Tin Can, was that we didn't want it to work like SCORM. We didn't want it to work like every LMS out there in the world decides to store its data in a different way, and so that there's no way to pull data out and share it amongst systems, right? That was a key tenet of xAPI. So xAPI is intended to not be siloed. So as great as that is, and as helpful as it has proven to be, that does make it more complicated to have data and creation of data that is useful in a semantic way. So definitely, if we're creating statements, that we expect to be used by multiple systems, multiple experiences over time, if we plan on building on that, then it's worthwhile to be specific and be intentional about the choices that you're making on whether or not you're reusing terms, whether or not you're creating new terms. And there is a place here where if the data you're creating from your learning record provider, your experience, is not ever expected to interact with another system, maybe it's for internal use only, maybe it's data just to support the interface of this application, then xAPI may not be the right choice. You can capture virtually anything in xAPI. Any sort of data you can capture it in xAPI. Whether or not you should is definitely a different story. And that's the one that we talk about when we say, will this data ever appear in another system, or do we expect it to ever appear in the other system? If it's for internal use only, then it may not need to be xAPI data. The other key there is, because it's an open format, because it's a thing that can be generated after the fact, because of the way timestamps work and those types of things inside of xAPI, it's very easy to translate one data format to xAPI after the fact. So that's another place where it may not need to start out that way, but as soon as we recognize, oh, we'd like to have this data in another system, oh, I'd like to bring in an analytics tool, well, that's when we start looking at xAPI. So xAPI profiles, again, this group is really nice to speak to because most of you, or hopefully all of you, have heard of xAPI profiles. So I'm just going to go through these again real quickly. So what is it? It's a way to achieve semantic interoperability, right? It's a way so that we can create data from different sources that machines, systems can already understand. A profile is a place that you can list your terms. You can keep an ID, a list of all of the identifiers for those terms. You can even publicize it so someone else could find your profile and leverage the experience you've already had in making those. So some examples I like to give. The step tracker is one that I think really captures this really well, with a kind of some funny sidebars to it. But back a few years ago, step trackers became all the rage. Fitbit comes out with one of the first step trackers, captures all sorts of data. So if they had created a profile, if they had decided to use xAPI data, if they had created a profile that said, this is how we are going to track steps and activities, going up and down staircases, all of the things that we know and expect fitness trackers to do now, then the next system that comes along could use that same profile. So maybe Nike comes out with their device and Nike says, oh, well, Fitbit did it this way. And so I'm going to do it the same way, so that all of these third-party applications that already understand Fitbit's data will now just immediately start working. They'll already understand Nike's data. Now, the funniest addition to this is the Apple Watch, because we all know Apple would never do this. But Apple Watch could have done the same thing, where they said, okay, there's already 3 or 4, 5, 10 entrants in this industry who are all generating data the same way. They're all tracking step activity the same way. And there's lots of reporting tools, lots of data analytics tools that already understand that data. So when I create my device, I'm going to use that profile. And that's the idea behind a profile. So that's a good example. Possibly a better one in the industry is, this is one that we've actually worked towards with one of our customers, is developing a profile for CPR dummies. Because it doesn't really matter who creates the CPR dummy. To support the industry expectations, those dummies are all going to have the same or similar data around number of chest compressions, depth of chest compression, number of breaths, volume of air, like all of these types of things. I'm not an expert in CPR, but those are key pieces of information that every one of those CPR dummies needs to provide. It doesn't matter who manufactures the dummy. And so if all of the CPR vendors get together and they say, we're going to use the same data profile, then the systems out there that understand that data don't have to worry about which of those vendors produced the actual model that's being used in the classroom. So CMI5, something that I've worked a lot on in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, is another case where there's a profile. And one of the things that we identified very early on with xAPI was that, going from just the SCORM process, the traditional e-learning model, into capturing data with xAPI meant that there was a whole set of problems that we introduced without providing a good solution. And that problem largely looks like a launch session. And it's really something that every experience has. Every experience has a start. Every experience has a finish. Just about every experience has something like passed, failed, and completed. And so those are the types of things that show up in CMI5. So CMI5 is a profile that gives us a session wrapper. And why does that matter? It matters because we can immediately start out from a standard meaning of what it looks like to be a session. A session has a start, a session has an end, or a session has a start and a session gets abandoned. Those are concepts that the working group who understand xAPI have been talking about for years. So we can go out and we can say, we know every experience out there in the market, whether or not it's traditional e-learning or an in-person simulation or an AR, VR tool. All of those things are going to start from this place of something started this thing up and something finished it. Everything in between can be whatever data you like. If you want to use one of these other profiles inside of a CMI5 session wrapper, feel free. But we can at least start, the LMSs in the industry can start from a place of, I know that the user was doing something inside of this session. And that's really the key to CMI5. So what do you do? I've mentioned that there's all kinds of problems. There's a huge amount of flexibility here. There's a huge amount, or what feels like a huge amount of responsibility as far as creating your own terms, doing all of those types of things. Well, my advice is get your job done, because at the end of the day, we can have all of this beautiful data. We can have all of these brilliantly defined terms. We can have perfect profiles that can go into the profile server and get validated and all of that. But if at the end of the day, the data doesn't help you achieve the goal that you wanted to achieve, then it's all really kind of academic. So, if you need to set out to capture some data about some experience, then just start capturing data. Start creating terms, start seeing what's out there, look at CMI5, say, is the session wrapper right for me? If it is, start there, and then work up from that. But the key is ship software, right? The other thing, obviously, the clearer your communication is, the less misinterpretation and resulting trouble you run into. And this is mostly down the line, right? So one of the things that people say is xAPI data is fairly heavy, and I agree. There are lighter weight ways to do things. But in the end, you can only have an experience once, right? And so if you don't capture data about an experience while it's happening, then you'll never be able to get that data back. So when one of our pieces of advice to people is start out thinking from the other end. What is the goal that you're trying to get to? What is the problem you're trying to solve? So make sure that the data includes at least enough to get there. That's obviously the ship your software notion. The other piece is, if you think there's other data and you're just not ready to use it, but you can capture it now, start by capturing it and find the use for it later. Now, does that mean capture data about every single mouse click? Again, I think that's a bad practice. Don't do that. But if it's the difference between just using a CMI5 session to track that a learner did something versus visited particular web pages, even if you don't plan on using the visited particular web pages data later, go ahead and capture it now, because eventually you're going to want that. And you will have years and years worth of data that you can then go back and you can look at and leverage. So I think that's it. Again, I mentioned earlier that this kind of came out of a blog post. So when these slides get shared, when this presentation gets shared, I definitely encourage you to go out, look at the blog post, read through it. And then, that's kind of your journey towards this concept of meaning and making your data actually mean something. So I think I'm going to take a few questions. Let's see. Stephen asked 3 or 4 here. Are we talking about interoperability between multiple LRSs or other types of systems? I don't know exactly when that occurred, but probably multiple types of systems. And LRS interoperability should be fairly boring as a concept because the xAPI specification itself is designed to enable that. So usually when I'm talking about interoperability, I'm talking about pulling data possibly from multiple LRSs, or at least from one LRS that has multiple experiences associated with it, to use in reporting tools, data analytics tools, maybe machine learning tools, any of those types of things that can ingest that data. George asks, is there an xAPI profile besides CMI5 that you think exemplifies good verb selection? I think the video profile is probably the one that people point to the most, and I think they did a reasonably good job with it. I think it lacks any sort of version information in its category activity, which is kind of a disappointment for me. I'd like to have seen that added, but I think that's a decent place to start. It's certainly one that we've used. We have leveraged a PDF profile. And there are a number of others out there. Honestly, we don't look at them that closely because we're not generally in the business of producing an experience. We're more on the standard side, so we're looking at something like CMI5 that can be generic across all experiences. So I think this cohort group, the industry groups, are the ones where we're going to start to see much better definition of profiles. Let's see, Jen asks, can you comment on satisfied versus completed? I fight this battle constantly, that these are not the same thing. I hear you, Jen. I fight it too. I fight it on the CMI5 working group call even. Those guys ought to know better. So at least within CMI5, we talk about completed as actually completing an activity or getting to 100% progress, even if that means failing. So you can be done with a test, you can have completed the test, and maybe you got either a pass or a fail, or maybe it hasn't even been graded, but that thing is completed. Satisfied to me and to the CMI5 group means that you've done everything to earn satisfaction. That's it, to whatever satisfaction means in that context. So within CMI5, satisfied happens at a block level or a course level. And so essentially for a course, it'd be kind of like you went through and you met the criteria that is necessary to satisfy the course. And satisfying the course probably means something to someone out in the real world. So if this is a course about CPR, well, you are now CPR certified when you have satisfied the course. Just completing it isn't sufficient for that. And so that's the way I think of these things. So satisfaction within CMI5, again, this is a place where the working group has done a lot of work thinking about these things. What meaning can we derive from it? So satisfied there means completed, passed, completed or passed, or completed and passed, or this weird non-applicable, you're automatically satisfied all the time thing. But so those are the places where we've been going through and been pedantic, and we've said, what are the logic cases here? What's our logic table look like? What does it mean to satisfy something? And then you have to do that for all of the elements of the structure of the course itself. And you can get satisfied at different levels. Let's see, there's a question, is there a way to translate if one system uses a different verb than another, but I wanted to harmonize all the data? Yes, so the concept of a synonym was something we thought about a long time ago, and it's essentially not in the xAPI specification. Really, this is the next set of specifications. This is the thing that says, okay, we can go out and we can create profiles that understand multiple different types of terms for the same meaning. And whether or not that gets captured via the xAPI profile spec or whether that's the next thing, I don't really know personally myself, but it's definitely a thing that we can do. We can start to say, these 10 verbs all map to the concept of completion, for instance, if all we care about is completion. How do you know, which verbs are used across popular platforms? I don't know that there's a great way at the moment. The xAPI profile server concept from ADL is definitely a step in the right direction. It is the place where we feel like this community can gel around the concept of a profile, can start publishing those out there, can start working in, I think, what they call communities of practice. My domain experience is e-learning standards, which is why I work on CMI5. But if I was an academic working on, some sort of medical thing, or if I worked for a CPR dummy company, then that's the type of profile I'd, be trying to generate, be creating, be put out there into the world saying, hey, this other person from a company that does something similar, what do you think of this data? Does this data match up with what you're seeing from your side? What do you need for your customers? And then that kind of goes back and forth. Let's see. There's a comment about Percipio and their statements only needing 8 different verbs. Yeah, that seems entirely appropriate. The set of verbs itself is boundless. The set of verbs that you can use in experience is boundless. But certainly the vast majority of experiences that we've seen out there really leverage probably 8 to 10 of them. We're just not really beyond a point where we can capture more data than that, and that data will be relevant in our use case. There's certainly a place where we start to get to 15, 20, 50, 100 verbs, but we're not there yet, even 10 years into this grand experiment. Now, there's a comment about using scored versus completed. And there's the perfect comment here is unless the consuming system needs to use, X. And that's where I go back to, make sure you get your work done, because you can spend countless decades on thinking through all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, if the system out there that already exists that you want to use expects one thing versus what you're using, then you need the flexibility to be able to send that data that way. Yeah, there's a comment Jen made about LMSs, that don't recognize satisfied. That's true, and that's where CMI5, even though it's been out for 6 years or so as a quote unquote 1.0 version, still has relatively low adoption. That's where we need to start to push that forward, where we can see more LMSs, more launch systems understanding CMI5 because it has a profile in it, because it has established what the meaning of that data looks like. I think that's all I've been primed on. I'm happy to answer any other questions. I know my assistants, which I hesitate to even call them that, have been hanging out in the chat and looking at the QA. A shout out to Alicia and Tara, who I'd love to say I created this beautiful presentation, but that's not the case. This is all them. I just get up here to stand and yammer on about it for a while. There's a question about how concerned we should be about non-xAPI conformant LMS eventually becoming xAPI conformant. I don't have a great answer for that. If you're really looking to be excited and using xAPI, then I'd probably be pretty concerned. There's definitely a place where talking to that LMS vendor and asking them what their roadmap looks like and potentially why they are or have not pursued xAPI is definitely an interesting question for them. While we see adoption rates that are still significantly lower than SCORM, mostly because it's been out for 20 years, there's definitely a place where I'd be concerned if they're not looking in this direction, because the industry, the DoD, definitely seems to be looking for how do we capture more relevant data than just passed, completed, scores, times in experience, etc. So everything in the e-learning industry and outside of it points to more data, or at least better data that we can extract different meaning from. In other words, now we're starting to look at beyond compliance training. We're starting to look at how do we actually train our employees? How do we get them to learn something? As we move in that direction from an instructional design standpoint, then systems that don't have the ability to capture those different kinds of data, to validate it, to leverage the meaning out of it, will seemingly, to me, get left behind, certainly. I don't think compliance is going away anytime soon. At least that's what the lawyers say. But there is a place where having more rich data is going to be what our end users, our learners actually require, because they are learners. They're not just trainees. Stephen mentions concern about verbs sending now to an LRS having different meaning when the LMS eventually adds xAPI conformance. Yeah, it's certainly a concern. I think some of that becomes, what does the volume of data look like? And how similar is it to other systems? And I think that was where that other question came from. So, the major authoring tools all support similar looking types of data. That's a place to look at and say, okay, we need to leverage, that type of data. Or again, this is where CMI5 comes into play, where if you, have an experience that is using CMI5, then it's a pointer for you to go to your LMS vendor and say, look, this is the data you need to understand, because it's what the industry is suggesting. It's what the industry is supporting. I think systems that truly get to a point where they adopt xAPI and meaning becomes an interesting concept to them will absolutely have to have a way to understand this synonym, even antonym, relationship, where we can map a set of verb identifiers or a term identifiers to a particular meaning that then gets drawn in their reporting, or it shows up in their learner tables, or those types of things. So I believe I'm coming up on my time here. I want to thank everybody. Thank you for your participation in the xAPI cohort itself. I participated in the very first one of these, and it was kind of an interesting experience for me, because I'd already been thinking about this stuff for the better part of a year or more, writing libraries and all of those kinds of things. So, but it also rejuvenates me whenever I go to a conference, or I go to a, something like this, where it's like there are so many new people interested in this, and so it really is kind of this groundswell of, even though I've been thinking about it for 10 years, this number of people thinking about it definitely excites me. So. I think that's pretty much it. Everybody enjoy the rest of your party day and your break. It's coming up. And yeah, obviously feel free to shoot an email to Russ to see. We're happy to answer questions about, xAPI, profiles, any of this stuff, SCORM, obviously, our LRS products. I look forward to seeing maybe a few of you on the CMI5 working group calls. I know Thomas did a presentation earlier. He's a participant there. So it's definitely always nice to have some fresh blood there.